Hello ladies and gentlemen, Top Hat Gaming Man here, and I got one particularly interesting Patreon Q&A question this week in which I would like to talk about in detail. Audrey Sampson asked me what games would I like to see on a Nintendo 64 Classic, and that question quickly brought me to quite an alarming realisation about that fantasy system. And that was, if there is a Nintendo 64 Mini, is it going to be bloody awful? Yes! Why do I say it might be awful? Because, as we've discussed quite a few times on this channel, the Nintendo 64 has a very limited library in comparison to many other consoles. It's got significantly less games on it than the NES, the Super Nintendo, and its competition like the Sony PlayStation and the Sega Saturn, and even the previous 16 and 8-bit great consoles like the Master System and the Mega Drive. It's got one of the smallest libraries around. And this is where, but again, I suppose with one of these mini systems, you only need about 20 to 30 games really, and there's probably more, well, there is more than 30 good games on the Nintendo 64. But here's where it gets quite depressing. A good 10 of those great games, 10 of the greatest games on the Nintendo 64, wasn't actually produced by Nintendo in the first place. They was all produced by Rare. GoldenEye, Banjo-Kazooie, Banjo-Tooie, Conker's Bad Fur Day, Diddy Kong Racing, Donkey Kong 64, Jet Force Gemini, Perfect Dark. The list just goes on and on. Like I said, there's around 10 decent games in which they produced, and those are the games most people would think of when they think about the Nintendo 64. And obviously these days, Rare is now owned by Microsoft rather than being a second party developer for Nintendo. So if Rare are actually owned by Microsoft, then it's highly unlikely that you're going to be able to get the best Nintendo 64 games on a Nintendo 64 Mini. If it was to happen, Nintendo would have to cut an unprecedented deal with Microsoft, the likes of which we have never seen before. So, if there is a Nintendo 64 Mini on the horizon, we can really only expect the first party games. So what can we really expect? Obviously you could have the Ocarina of Time on there and Majora's Mask, but as we know that's a bit pointless really, as you have superior versions available on the 3DS these days anyway. And again, you could have Mario 64 on there too, but again, there's a better version, arguably with this one I'd say, on the DS. So what you could have Mario 64, the two Zelda games, Mario Kart obviously, Smash Brothers, Lilac Wars, so that's 6 good games you could have, but apart from that, where can you go from there really? I'm sure there's someone reeing right now saying, you forgot this game, you forgot F-Zero, which I did. I just remembered you put F-Zero on there as well. But look, when you take Rare out of the equation, it's really difficult to think of good Nintendo 64. Good Nintendo 64 games. You could chuck in there the odd sports ones: Mario Golf, Mario Tennis, the Mario Party. So basically, the Nintendo 64 Mini without Rare would mainly be a Mario and Zelda player, rather than be a balanced system like the SNES Mini, for example, which had loads of JRPGs on the thing, and you got fighters on there like Street Fighter. The best fighter again on the 64 is made by Rare, yet again, Killer Instinct. So, the Nintendo 64 Mini, what games would I like to see on it? I'd like to see basically those games I just listed from Nintendo, and I would like to see the Rare games on there as well. But I think that's highly unlikely that it could happen. I think Treasure made a few good Nintendo 64 games in my opinion. You got Mischief Maker, for example, Bangai-O, however you pronounce that. But again, it's not been translated into English yet, so it'd be a lot of effort to make an English translation to put that on the platform. Bomberman games are quite good. Well, yes, Bomberman 64 and Bomberman Second Attack are quite good. There's a Japan exclusive Bomberman game as well, what's also called Bomberman 64, which is quite amusing. So not like to see that, because again, it needs translating. Bomberman Hero, which I think is rather naff, if I do say so myself. So Nintendo 64 Mini not looking that bright without Rare. But yeah, the games I'd like to see on it, as I said, everything I've mentioned really. So Nintendo 64 Mini, what do you think, ladies and gentlemen? Could Nintendo get Microsoft on board to allow all the best Nintendo 64 games to be placed on the little Nintendo 64 system? To be fair, the best thing about a Nintendo 64 Mini is the thought of 4-player games on a Mini. That would be fun, wouldn't it? Like, again, what have you got from Nintendo? Mario Kart, Smash Brothers, and F-Zero, I suppose. But again, a lot of the best multiplayer games, Rare, GoldenEye, which is perhaps the most iconic, most famous game of the entire Nintendo 64 era, and that's the game I hear people often getting the most nostalgic about, even though, to be fair, it's not very good these days in comparison to most third-person shooters that are on the market. So yes, again, Diddy Kong Racing, that'd be really fun, wouldn't it, to play multiplayer on a Nintendo 64 Mini? But will it happen? So, ladies and gentlemen, if Nintendo was ever to make a Nintendo 64 Classic Edition and Rare were not involved, which 30 games would you like to see on the Nintendo 64 Mini? Because I think it would be quite challenging to come up with a realistic list of 30 good games for the platform. Because as I said, the Rare games are some of the most iconic on the platform. The only other games that are in that tier of iconology, I suppose, is again Mario 64, Mario Kart, the Zeldas, and probably Smash. Maybe Lilac Wars, Star Fox 64. But apart from that as well, all the other big name games are from Rare. In fact, thinking about it, let's forget about the Nintendo 64 Mini altogether. Like, the library is just not that interesting, and Nintendo 64 games aren't exactly expensive to buy these days anyway, so it's not hard to amass the small Nintendo 64 library. Let's have a bloody Virtual Boy Mini instead. That would be more fun, wouldn't it? Wasn't even bloody released in Europe, so got a whole new market who've never even been exposed to this thing. And as well, like, who wouldn't want to try Wario Land for the Virtual Boy, or Teleroboxer, or Jack Brothers, or many of the other fantastic little red and black games that can be found on the platform. So yes, let's not have a Nintendo 64 Classic, because it wouldn't be the same without Rare. Let's have a Virtual Boy Classic instead. Yeah. Cheerio!